David Ruffey representing Margot Kingston's web diary, and Margot apologises, she would have loved to have been here tonight.
Hello, Margot.
Given where we come from, a question that seems fairly obvious. Mainstream media basically doesn't cover the sorts of things you've said tonight, and you're pretty much a lone voice saying that kind of analysis. And I'm not even convinced, maybe you can reassure me, that the analysis you've just given us is publishable even by you in the mainstream media here. What do you think can happen to change that?
I think most of what I've said here tonight I've published one way or another in the Herald and in books, but mostly in the Herald. I think I can't accuse the Herald, and I wouldn't accuse the Herald of tempering my copy in any way, or of ever having cut it for political reasons. It hasn't happened, and I'd like to stress that. It will only happen if reporters keep going. You can't analyse and comment on what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Afghanistan from Sydney, from New York, because if you do it, in truth, you're basing it on press releases. You have to go and see what's happening. Fairfax is putting up enough money for me to go there as often as I can go and live a sane life and maintain personal relationships and the rest of it. But more often than not, I'm the only Australian reporter on the ground in Iraq or Afghanistan. The ABC turns up quite often, but during the whole of the Douglas Wood drama earlier this year, which was an Australian story happening in Iraq rather than an Iraq story, I was the only one there. So it's up to readers, and it's up to editors, and it's up to proprietors. Readers to put pressure, readership pressure, editors to put pressure on proprietors for money, because it is expensive, and generally for a sense by all of those parties to care about our world, and to go back to those questions that I posed about the responsibility that we now have. I mean, we all smile when we see the words Australian occupation power in the one sentence, but we were. That's what we did, and we are now responsible. Even though we're stuck down in what I call the back pocket of Iraq, we are responsible. All of us are responsible for what happens there.
Can I take you back to Iraq, please? 45 years since I've been there, but one of the things that I felt was going to save Iraq is education, education, education. Can you tell me if there is any sign that the majority of the people in Iraq are in any way being educated?
Schools have opened. Schools exist. The American spin would have you believe that there were no schools in Iraq before they arrived. That's not quite the case. There were schools, and they were reasonably well attended, but they had the usual drivel about Saddam and a twisted curriculum. That's not the case now. There are good numbers going to school, but the kids are going to school in an environment where there's a security crisis. Their parents are not worrying about whether they're coming home to do their homework. They're worried about whether they're coming home alive. They're worrying whether they're safe, whether they're going to come home when they send them out in the morning. I mean, the whole place is locked, gripped in this security crisis, because you don't know where a bomb is going to go off. You don't know who it's going to kill. You don't know when it's going to go off. So things are happening in schools, but it's hard to get excited about them because of these greater security issues.
Okay, one on this side.
Several months ago, in the early, maybe a year into the Iraqi war, your newspaper was Sydney Morning Herald. I read a little comment from someone from our Defense Department, and that person used the phrase anti-Iraqi insurgency. That's anti-Iraqi insurgency. That struck me very, very much as a measure of misunderstanding of the situation. And my question relates to, is aimed at this issue. The main powers now active in Iraq, that is United States and UK, Australia as well, coincidentally, have never had in a living memory an experience of foreign occupation. And I believe that these people simply do not understand the moral power of being anti-occupation, regardless of what you think, regardless of whether the regime that was there before was good or bad. Suddenly the issue is that someone alien is trotting on your land, and therefore...
Perhaps I could answer by telling you a story. For much of 1992, I think I spent 9 months of the year in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, writing what I thought were very sensible pieces, analysis and commentary on the need for people to get over their historic baggage, to be able to see that they should be able to live together and understand each other and accommodate each other, and what a wonderful world this would be if they could do that. At the end of the year, I was asked by the Sydney Morning Herald, by Good Weekend magazine, to go back to Ireland and to write a piece on growing up in bandit country. And part of that included joining the small groups of Southern Irishmen who are going out on a regular basis to the border and reopening crossings that had been closed by the British. So we went off to a little town called Clonus, and we met at the church on a Sunday morning. We all went to Mass, got out of the church, and there was picks and shovels lined up. We were each given our implement. A tin whistle and a boron drum fell in with us, and we marched to the border as this band played Irish music, Republican music. And I will never forget the emotion where my brain just cut out and my gut kicked in as we marched on our border to open it. I was frightened by my own reaction to it. So you're right. It's very hard for people who deal with things in abstract terms to deal with the emotional side and to factor in the emotional side of issues of nationalism, territory, and occupation.
I wonder whether you'd care to elaborate a little bit on British motivation and involvement in Iraq, please.
I think it works on several levels. I think Tony Blair was very uncomfortable dealing with Europe in terms of where Europe should be on Iraq, and was going to give himself a better platform as a bridge, as he hoped, between Europe and the US if he joined the American side of the equation. But I think also that the British genuinely believed, and up to a point the Americans believed too, that the British had an historic understanding of Iraq that was needed on the ground. It hasn't got through as much as it ought to have, and the British are having a very interesting time dealing with the Iranian move into the south of Iraq at the moment as the Americans leave them to try and run it and to maintain authority down there.
Whether you'd like to elaborate a little, you mentioned the causes of America and the Allies going into Iraq, but you didn't actually mention oil as one of those causes, and whether you feel that oil is a cause for America going in originally, and whether it still is, and whether they can afford to in any way pull out because of the requirements which they have for oil. And secondly, whether you perhaps could give us some hope for one who opposed the war originally and who now sees it as being absolutely a quagmire where it's catch-22. If there is a draft brought in America and a draft brought in Australia, it will just make the matters worse because the publics in both nations would rebel more than they have already.
No speakers are flattening your tone, but I think you were talking first about oil. Oil's an issue. Was it the principal driving issue? I don't think so. But when Americans talk about their national interest in the region, that's what they're talking about. They are talking about oil. Saudi Arabia teeters these days. The Americans have been dependent, not just the Americans, the entire economy of the Western world has been dependent for the last 50-odd years on the ability of the Saudis to control the international oil market. The Saudis are one of the two countries that have the oil reserves that give them the capacity to increase or decrease the flow of oil that they put into the international market by sufficient quantities to vary the price. Everybody else in the market is producing at maximum capacity. The Saudis are not. They can go up and down. They have the added advantage that their oil is the cheapest to bring to the surface. Their oil is about $2, $3 a barrel to get to the surface as opposed to $27, $29 a barrel in Siberia. Now, the Americans in their planning, in their forecasting, know that they can't rely on the Saudis anymore into the future. There's only one other country that fits the bill in terms of quantities of oil, cost of production. So if they can get Iraq producing, they have another Saudi Arabia. So if I was George Bush or if I was Dick Cheney, I'd want Iraq in my back pocket right now.
Last one? This gentleman first.
Yes, back during the Vietnam War, well, there was conscription, and the National Guard stayed home. Now the National Guard's doing the fighting out there in Iraq. Nobody ever uses the word conscription anymore. Do you think it'll ever come up for discussion?
We don't use the word conscription, but there's a lot of debate in the US at the moment about a draft. George Bush is adamant that there'll be no sacrifice for anything. The whole war on terror, the Iraq War, Katrina. There seems to be no shortage of funds in his view, and therefore no need for any national sacrifice. And that still includes the notion of a draft or conscription. Whether that's going to change, we won't know until next year. The numbers are going to be a serious problem in the northern spring, which is March, April. The Americans will not be able to, if the analysis out of Washington is correct, the Americans will not be able to meet their planned rotations with the numbers they now have. There just aren't enough bodies. So a call will have to be made between now and then. I wouldn't expect a draft. I think it's just it would just tip public opinion so badly against the whole enterprise that they'll find another way around it, which will be to just do it with fewer bodies, lesser rotations. But there's going to be a lot of, remember I said there were three centers of gravity: the Iraqi people, the American people, and the American military, and how the American military is treated in terms of how much time they have to put in and how many rotations they have to do, or the length of the rotations. That will be very telling.